While I say that distros don't generally matter once you have enough experience working with Linux that you know how to set stuff up yourself, there is one area where it still does tend to matter, especially if most of the packages you're going to be installing come from the standard repos like most people on Linux probably are going to be doing, and that is the difference between a stable release and a rolling release distro. Two things to get out of the way. When I say stable, I don't mean stable as in it won't crash. That's not what we mean when we say a stable release. What we actually mean is stable as in an unchanging environment. And when it comes to a rolling release, unlike some people like to put out there, a rolling release doesn't just mean the unstable development branch. While you can technically make a rolling release from that, I don't want people to think that an unstable development branch is the regular experience you get from using a rolling release distro. Let's start then with a rolling release. The first thing you'll notice is if you go to the download page for any rolling release distro, the ISO won't actually have a version number. While the ISO might be timestamped saying it was made on this day, or in some cases the ISO might technically be versioned, it'll have like the version of the kernel it's included with. It's not really a version the same way that it is for a stable release. So if I go and download this version of the ISO, I could go and keep using this exact same install forever into the future. As long as this distro is still being maintained, I don't ever have to reinstall it. I can just update it as soon as the updates are available. Some examples of rolling releases will be things like Arch Linux, and the distros based on Arch, things like Manjaro, Arco, Artix, or distros like Void Linux or Gentoo, for example. All of these things are rolling releases. And all of this sounds great. I guess everyone should just use a rolling release then. And there are a lot of benefits in actually doing so. The most obvious benefit is more up-to-date packages. So if there's a new feature available for your favorite program, as soon as the update is available as a stable release, it's probably going to be available very shortly after on your distro, assuming your distro is actually being well maintained. Rather than having to go to the Git repo, working out the dependencies yourself, trying to work out how to compile it, all of that can be done from your standard repos. That doesn't mean that using a rolling release only has binaries. Things like Gentoo is going to be a source-based distro, but it does still obfuscate the source code behind your package manager. I'm steering clear of the word cutting edge like you would see in an unstable development branch, because usually what you're going to see on a rolling release is a stable version of the program just released more often than it would be on a stable release. But not every stable release of a program is actually well made. So sometimes you might download an update to a program, think it's going to be perfectly fine, but find out that version is actually completely broken. While this doesn't happen all of the time for most programs, most devs out there are actually good at developing, occasionally you will run into updates like that that do break the program. Usually though, there's going to be a fix that does come out fairly quickly, and once that update does come out, you'll be able to download that fairly quickly as well. If you're the sort of person who likes to run the newest of the newest hardware, let's say you just bought a new GPU that's using a new GPU architecture, it came out like yesterday or a couple of days ago. Good luck doing that on a stable release, because you're probably going to need new drivers, and those drivers probably aren't going to be available yet, but on the rolling release, it's very likely you'll see them within due time. All of that sounds great, but there are some drawbacks. If you use a rolling release, you cannot avoid this. You will have to update your system, and you will have to update your system a lot. That doesn't mean multiple times a day. It doesn't even necessarily mean multiple times a week. But you will have to make sure you're updating it at least once a week, at a bare minimum, to make sure that nothing breaks into the future. Which wouldn't be that big of a deal if we weren't still worrying about internet speeds. I know that places like South Korea have been experiencing gigabit for many, many years. But here, that's just not a thing. Maybe I could pay like $1,000 a month for a business connection, but for a home connection, it's just not gonna happen. And if you do start to wait too long between updates, you might start to see some system breakages. It's not the long updates themselves that cause the breakage. what causes it is sometimes things in the repo changes. Sometimes owners of packages change. Sometimes names change. Sometimes packages get replaced. And if you update week by week, these things will be naturally sorted out as you update. If you wait too long and you have too many of these conflicts happening at the same time, sometimes they can't all be resolved. It also makes it very difficult to assume the package version someone's actually running. If you're on a stable release, you can say that version of Ubuntu is running this specific version of this package, and you know that exists. But if you're on something like Arch, it could be any number of packages. They could be running a version of Arch they haven't updated in like 5 weeks, and that version of Arch is going to look the exact same as something that is completely up to date. While I did start on Arch and I do like rolling releases myself, I don't think new users should be doing it. It's a really bad idea unless you're a really techie person. Because let's say you have a power outage during a kernel update. During a regular program update, not a big deal. During a kernel update, you're probably going to break your system. That might not sound like that big of a deal. And, power outages, that can't be that likely. I have seen countless people on the Manjaro subreddit complaining about this exact thing. If you are not comfortable recovering from that state, do not use a rolling release. Now, moving on to stable releases, which you might also hear referred to as static, point, or version releases, these would be things like, say, Debian, Fedora, Ubuntu, Pop! OS, which might not actually be a stable release going into the future, Mint, and other things like this. So, what indicates a stable release is that it actually has a version release. Things like, say, Debian 10, Ubuntu 2104, Pop! OS 20.10. Similar to how you have something like Windows, where you have Windows 7, Windows 10, Windows 11, things like this. Now, how stable a stable release actually is really does depend on the specific distro. Standard fare is to have the kernel and the core software and software libraries basically being unchanging, and these only change whenever you have a new major release. This is when the first number of the version number actually changes. Then things like security patches and third-party package upgrades, those will be released with any of the minor releases. When you have a stable release, it's always very clear what specific packages are available for that version. So this can be very useful in the case of a development environment where you need to know exactly what you're working with, but it's not just helpful for that. It also really helps if you're trying to get some support for your distro, because if you say, I'm running Ubuntu 2104, people know, okay, you are running this version of whatever package you're having trouble with, and it makes it much, much easier to troubleshoot issues, rather than on Arch Linux where it's like, you're running Firefox. Okay, well, what version of Firefox are you running? Okay, now I need to work out what's wrong with that specific version, and it becomes a bit of a hassle to work through. Also, for a well-managed distro, you're going to have a very clear release cycle. Unlike on a rolling release where updates will just come in whenever those updates are available, maybe you'll have a minor release once every month, and then a new major release once every 6 months or once every 9 months, and that's when you know that things are going to need to be updated. So a stable release generally means a much easier environment to work with. But that doesn't mean that stable releases are inherently better either. You can have some serious problems. Let's say, for example, the distro were to ship with a broken package, a broken web browser config, or a broken audio server config, or a broken printer driver. These things are not going to be fixed for quite a while, and for things like a web browser, that might be a pretty big deal. And even when you do get a new release, it's almost certain that the packages you get won't be as up to date as they possibly could be, because the devs need to go and test the applications to make sure they don't ship with broken packages, so you're always going to be slightly behind unless the program we're talking about has a really slow release cycle as well. And the other really serious problem is eventually the version you're running will hit its end of life. This is basically when the devs say, okay, we are no longer going to support this, you get no more minor releases, and no more package updates are going to come to that version. Like you see over on Windows, where eventually Windows 10, I think in 2025, is no longer going to receive security updates, and basically they're saying, if you keep using this, good luck. We don't really care what happens anymore. And before that happens, you need to go and reinstall your operating system to install the new version. Now, how this is handled really does depend on the specific distro. Some distros will make you go and re-download the ISO and reinstall your operating system basically from scratch. A well-made distro, though, will have some sort of migration tool built into it to go from whatever version you're currently on up to the new version. Basically, the same idea that Apple has where you can go from one version of macOS up to the next version without having to go and do really anything else yourself. So then there is the ultimate question of which is better, especially which is better for a new Linux user. And I know there's likely going to be a heated argument about which one actually is better, but I don't think I can really say one is better than the other. I think it really does depend on what your goal in using Linux actually is. If you always want to have really up-to-date packages and run really new hardware, but maybe it'll be a little bit rough around the edges and occasionally stuff might break a little bit because you forgot to update for a while, and you're, say, a more techie user, sure, a rolling release is going to be great. But if you want to have something that maybe is a little bit out of date, but you know it's going to be a stable environment and you just want to use your computer, maybe for gaming or other stuff like that, sure, a stable release is also going to be great as well. Speaking from my personal experience, I run a rolling release on my home system because I like to tinker with stuff, and I find that running a rolling release makes that much easier to do. Sure, it does mean that stuff's occasionally going to break, but in my case, when something does break, I can basically just turn that into a video. Most people probably aren't in that situation. When it comes to any of my VPSs though, on those I typically run Ubuntu or Debian. I know I have had an Arch server in the past, I just wanted to do that to see how well it would work, but generally when I want something safe for my website, that is going to be on a stable release. Basically, I don't want to have to deal with constant updates happening and occasionally configs breaking because of that. I just want to know what works and basically leave it as it is, occasionally doing security updates, but that's about it. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. I am more than happy to have a discussion about it, and I totally didn't upload this video today because of a video I saw yesterday. That definitely didn't happen. Just a coincidence, definitely coincidence. Anyway, if you like this video and you'd like to support the channel and become one of these amazing people over here, please go check out my Patreon, Libera Pay, Subscribe Star, all linked in the description down below. I've got a podcast called Tech Over Tea available basically anywhere. I've got a gaming channel called Brodie Robertson Plays where I live stream twice a week and upload about 5 or so YouTube shorts. And this channel is also available over on Odyssey. That's going to be it for me, and I'm out.